Actually, it's funny because you actually have to look at the history of Ireland to understand this. When the Catholic Church was trying to basically assimilate the whole of Europe to their way of thinking, they were literally they were butchering their way through Europe. I mean,
Right.
this is a historical fact. And when they got to Ireland, they thought that they had eradicated every single vestige of this divine bloodline, which went back to Mesopotamia. Now, the connection there is that Mesopotamian people came from the Armenian highlands. And if you go back 12,000 years, you have these people called the people of Anu, who were the Anunnaki. And they're not nefarious people, as people tend to make them out to be. They're actually quite pleasant. And they're the kind of the concept of where we got the idea of the gods from.
Right.
They're the ones that gave us the accoutrements of civilization. So they can't be nasty people at the same time. They weren't perfect either, but that's another story. And they were described as being very, very tall, not giantesque by our standards, but just very, very tall. So when the Catholic Church gets to Ireland, they realize that there's this still incredible mythology of these tall people connected to this divine bloodline called the Tuatha De Danann, who originated were called the Tuatha De Danu around the Black Sea, who before that were called the Anunnaki. It's the same people, and the name just changes through time. We're talking 6,000 years of history in a few seconds here. So they began to rewrite the history and mythologize, or at least how we understand mythology to be, because mythology is a theatrical device that helps people explain real events from one culture to the next in a way that you can remember it. Because if you just tell the story straight, you're bound to forget it and then you'll embellish it. But if you put a nice sort of theatrical theme around it, you will remember it. For the same reason that we'll still be discussing Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader 100 years from now, because there's that method, but behind it, there's a real story of the development of a real person from light to dark and the redemption of that person. Well, the same thing was happening in Ireland. So in order for the Catholic Church to basically take over the entire mythology of people who still believed in this tall race of shining people, that was their nickname, the Shining Ones, they fictionalized the whole thing. And suddenly the people who were called the fair folk became fairies. That's where the idea comes from. But if you go back about 3,500 BC, when the Tuatha De Danu finally arrived in Ireland and became the Tuatha De Danann, it turns out that they had bumped into this very tall people called the Fomori, who also had been spread around the Scottish Islands as well. And they, by the description that we're given of very, very tall people, very brutish, covered with red hair, are the same people who are described in the Pacific, in South America, the Far East, and in Mesopotamia as being the vestiges of, and this is where I'm going to have to condense the story, they are the vestiges of a very bad marriage between a small group of the Shining Ones, who are called the Watchers, a particular group of them, for some reason that we don't know, they went against instructions. They married human women, and they basically begot very, very tall children. Now, their offspring became the giants covered with red hair. And we know this from the books of Enoch, who, by the way, was one of the Anunnaki. His real name was Emed Ur-Anu. He was not Enoch. That's a Hebrew sort of variation of the story. And so when the flood takes place 11,000 years ago, the idea was to wipe out these giant red-headed giants because they were mad. They were brutal. They were engaging in warfare. They were teaching humans how not to behave, and they would eat people for fun. Now, some of them obviously survived because they're still alive in the Solomon Islands in the Second World War, and the American military actually met them several times, and that's why they slept with a revolver under their pillow, not because of the Japanese, but because they said, because of these very tall, 15-foot tall giant people covered with red hair.
Whoa.
They've washed up on the shores of beaches in New Zealand only 30 years ago. So this is all historical facts. So the irony is that when the Tuatha De Danu and the Anunnaki moved to Ireland to escape their history of having to deal with these very nasty people, they're still living there. So this is the reason why in Britain we still have thousands of giants' graves. And I have known several archaeologists who gave up being archaeologists because they witnessed firsthand the destruction of all of these bones, because archaeology is a very conservative medium. They can't account for the tallness of these bones and skeletons that they keep finding in places called the giants' graves, which are still there to this very day. So it's absolutely true. The myth is correct because it's a historical appreciation and a depiction of what was taking place I'd say about 5 to 6,000 years ago in that part of the world.
Wow, that's mind blowing about about the World War. Like I had never heard that. Of course, we've heard conspiracies about the giant of Kandahar over in Afghanistan, and that's wild, and it's unfounded. There's no evidence of it, but now that kind of seems like maybe it could be one of these guys because it's described in a
Yeah.
similar fashion that it came out of a cave ready to eat everybody.
Yeah,
So
and
that's
they're still living up in the highlands of the Solomon Islands to this very day. And the villagers, to this very day, they'll say, well, we respect them. They used to be part of a very kind of a different race of people. They were a parallel culture. The flood wiped them out, and we leave them alone. They want to be left alone. They can't breed with anyone else. They're dying. And they get from A to B in the mountains through these caves, which are lit by this lichen, which glows in the dark. That's how they can see. And I've seen this in New Zealand as well. It's a specific form of lichen that in 10 minutes, you can see where you're going in total darkness.
wow.
You don't need flashlights. So to this very day, they're still talking about them and the bodies are still washing up. So I haven't heard the end of this story yet. So we've gone from science fiction and conspiracy to actual
Holy
fact.
crap. Yeah, that's unbelievable.
You can actually validate this stuff, which is what research is all about. It takes
Right.
time.